Good evening and welcome. I'm Melanie Ramey, the chair of the MCFR board for this year, and it's my pleasure to welcome you for this first event of the season and for the historic first event via Zoom. I know that we're all getting more used to using Zoom, and I will, though, give you a little instruction as to how we're going to do this evening. As you'll notice under your screen, you will see the word participants. Now, the participants are your fellow Zoomers tonight. You will not be able to see their pictures because there are too many of them, but you will be able to look on the right side, and there will be a list of them if you want to know who else is on. Also, in the next icon under the screen is the word chat. Now, if you will click on chat, you will see a column open on the right side of the screen. This is where we're going to be having questions this evening. So as Dr. Paris presents, if you have a question, if you will put it in the chat column, then I will be monitoring the questions and I will answer them in the way they are put in as soon as he has finished his presentation, because he has graciously consented to stay on for a while and respond to questions. I want to also publicly thank the MCFR board. We have met a number of times this summer as we have considered how is best to go forward with the organization. And we have been informed by the responses to the survey that we sent out as to how you all feel that the organization should proceed. And so we are acting upon the information that we got from the membership. I also want to really thank Ron Rossner and his committee, the program committee, because they really stepped up to develop this program and the program in October, and others are in the hopper. And this has been done on sort of a short notice, and I'm really appreciative of their work. I also want to call your attention to the October program. It will be on October the 26th, which is a Monday. It will be sponsored by the UW Division of International Studies, and it will be at 10 o'clock in the morning. And it's going to be at 10 o'clock in the morning because our speaker will be in Kiev, the Ukraine. And in order to accommodate his schedule so he won't have to stay up all night or get up in the middle of the night or whatever, we're having it at our time at 10 o'clock in the morning. Now, if this interferes with your sleep or your breakfast, too bad. You'll just have to try to deal with it. So in any event, it will be a very special program, as is this program this evening. And I want also to thank Roy Christensen for his special help in contacting our speaker this evening, Dr. Roland Paris. Now, we are so lucky to have him because he is really an expert in an area that we needed some expertise in. Dr. Paris is a professor at the University of Ottawa Graduate School on International Affairs and Policy. He is a fellow of the Royal Institute and Chatham House, and he is a former senior advisor on security and international affairs to the Prime Minister of Canada. So you see, he knows all about what we need to know about. Dr. Paris does research. He does his research on international security, sovereignty, and peace building. He is published in many academic journals, and he serves on 7 editorial boards. So I don't know when he even had time to stop and do his presentation, but we're really glad he took a break for us. He also has won a number of awards for his work. He's won 4 awards for his teaching, 3 awards for his public service, and the prestigious Grawemeyer Award for original ideas about improving the world order. So it's really a great pleasure to have Dr. Paris with us. So I will now turn the program over to him, and I think in his imagination, he can hear wild clapping in the background. So Dr. Paris.
Thank you, thank you. I can hear that wild clapping, and thank you for such a generous introduction. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with you tonight. And I'm not in Kiev, so I'm just 1 hour off of your time zone. Thank goodness for that. But I look forward to speaking in particular about Canada-US relations and to have a period of time after this presentation when we can when we can have a Q&A period, because then we can talk about precisely whatever interests the people who are, all of you who are attending this session. I should say that Canada-US relations, I approach it not just as a policy interest or an academic interest. My wife is an American citizen. I met her in graduate school. My children are dual citizens. One of them currently lives in the United States. Of course, my in-laws all live in the United States. I miss being able to visit them. I myself lived in your country for a decade. I began my career at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And that was after having lived in Washington, DC and Connecticut. So for me, Canada-US relations isn't just a policy interest or a academic interest. It has a very much a personal dimension. And the interesting thing is that it has a personal dimension for a lot of people on both sides of the border. And that has been true for a very long time. In 1936, Franklin Delano Roosevelt visited Quebec City. And he said this, he said, "I read in the newspaper that I was to be received with all the honors customarily rendered to a foreign ruler. I'm grateful for the honors, but something within me rebelled at the word foreign. I say this because when I have been in Canada, I have never heard a Canadian refer to an American as a foreigner. He's just an American. And in the same way, in the United States, Canadians are not foreigners, they are Canadians. That simple little distinction illustrates to me better than anything else the relationship between our two countries." That was FDR in 1936. And it's still true. The interconnections between our two societies are enormous, and they are diverse, and they provide the Canada-US relationship with an underlying stability, even at times of disagreement. And that's part of what I want to talk about today. I'm going to try and show you, hopefully even to surprise you, by the extent to which our two countries are linked together. We don't just trade goods, we produce things together. We share the same physical environment and we work together to manage it, from the Great Lakes to the oceans around us and the air we breathe. And the security of the continent is based on a partnership that might be one of the closest military and security alliances on the face of the planet. And when we're not living through an unprecedented public health emergency, literally millions of people move back and forth across our shared border every week. Of course, as the smaller partner, it's not surprising that Canadians are more aware of the United States than Americans are of Canada. I get it. As one of our former prime ministers said, Pierre Trudeau, this is the father of the current prime minister, he said in 1969, he said, quote, "Living next to you is in some ways like sleeping with an elephant. No matter how friendly or even temper is the beast, if I can call it that, one is affected by every twitch and grunt." Yet, whether most Canadians or Americans realize it or not, our bilateral relationship is actually profoundly and mutually beneficial. It very much serves the interests of both countries. And that's true today as much as before. So as we think about the future challenges that each of our countries is facing, the future of our economies, the future of our social cohesion and well-being, and our security relative to the rest of the world, we cannot allow this historic partnership between our two countries to be disrupted. We need to work together responding to these challenges, because doing so helps both our peoples and both our countries. And to be frank, many of us in Canada are concerned about the current state of the bilateral relationship, which despite its deep roots still requires constant tending. And I'll come back to this point and explain the concern a little bit, and also talk about ways of revitalizing the relationship. But first, let me do what I said I was going to do a few moments ago and paint a picture of how deeply connected our two societies already are. And to do so, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this is going to work. Boom. Can you see a slide that says Canada-US relations? You can. Very good. So let me just start with some basic facts. Canada is by far the #1 export market for the United States, and it's the #2 country in terms of imports. And to give you an idea of that volume, there is about $2 billion a day in Canada-US trade, $2 billion every single day. It's also true that Canada is the #1 export market for most US states, as you can see on this map, and it's the #2 export market for most of the remaining states. So let me just give you an idea of the scale here. The volume of trade between Michigan and the province of Ontario alone is larger than the total amount of trade between the United States and Britain, and larger than the total amount of trade between the United States and, with a few exceptions, virtually every other country in the world. That's the trade between one province, one Canadian province, and Michigan. 1.6 million jobs in the United States are directly supported by the sale of goods and services to Canada. I mean, this is enormous, and I think that sometimes we overlook the extent of that relationship. It's true for Wisconsin too. Wisconsin's top export markets here listed by in terms of value in billions of dollars in 2009, that red line is the equivalent of more than all those other blue lines stacked on top of each other. In other words, Canada is a larger export market for Wisconsin than Mexico, China, UK, Germany, Japan, and Australia all combined. And an estimated 137,000 jobs in your state depend on trade with Canada. So what about the trade balance? Well, this is a graph that's done from the Canadian perspective. So what you see, those green lines at the bottom, are a trade deficit for Canada, which is the equivalent of a trade deficit of a trade surplus for Wisconsin. And we can dig down a little bit deeper and see, well, what areas are we talking about? And again, this is from the Canadian standpoint. So all of those lines that go to the left are trade surplus for Wisconsin, and the one line that goes to the right is a trade deficit for Wisconsin, or a surplus for Canada. So basically, Wisconsin as a state has a surplus in everything but forest products, including, importantly, high value-added products like machinery and equipment. You can see how much of that is exported by Wisconsin to Canada. Now, you might say, aren't Canadians upset about this imbalance? Like, isn't everybody talking about trade balances and you don't want to be in the deficit and et cetera, et cetera? Well, the simple answer is no, for a couple of reasons. One, that trade surpluses and deficits are not the simple measures of success or failure that some people portray them to be. It's much more complicated than that. And secondly, because in this particular case, it doesn't really mean that much, because a lot of the things that are captured in this trade data, in other words, including a lot of the machinery and equipment that is exported from Wisconsin to Canada, are actually produced as a result of supply chains that crisscross the Canada-US border. In fact, 60% of all the products and services produced and sold between Canada and the United States contain components or raw materials that are sourced from the other country. In other words, when you capture in trade data the sale of something from Wisconsin to Canada, the chances are that that something actually contains a lot of things that were made in Canada in the first place, and vice versa, which means that these trade deficit surplus numbers have to be taken with an enormous grain of salt, maybe even a salt lick, that big a grain of salt. And what this means really is that in most sectors, if you think about these supply chains moving back and forth across the border with intermediate goods that are finally assembled in, final products, we're making stuff together. It's not just a matter of selling back and forth. We're making things together in a continental production platform. And that's something that isn't really captured in trade balance figures. And it's one of the reasons why that's not an alarming chart to me. And this is true, this crisscrossing of the border and these shared supply chains, even in agriculture. Consider the typical hamburger that you might eat at the local diner. So what you have here is a chart that shows, that the bun was maybe baked in California, but it might have been with flour from Saskatchewan. The beef might be from cattle that were born in Alberta, raised in Nebraska, and processed in Colorado. The bacon and the pigs might have been born and raised in Manitoba and processed in Iowa, and so on and so on. And by the way, this chart, I did not make this chart, but I did add the little blue thing in the corner there that says, and Wisconsin cheddar. So you see, even the great American hamburger, in some respects, this typical hamburger here before you is a North American product reflecting supply chains that crisscross the border. So if you think about intermediate goods, and those are products that go into making other things. They're not raw materials, but they're intermediate goods. Like flour is an intermediate good for bread. This shows the share of total imports that are intermediate goods. And fully a half of the goods that are traded across the Canada-US border, half of them are actually things that are going to be going into making something else. They're coming from one country and they're going to be made into something else. And then there may be some of those are going to be shipped back to the first country where that intermediate good originated. It's especially true of the automobile sector, where we very much have crisscrossing supply chains, and the typical North American car crosses the Canada-US border something like 4 times as it's being built and assembled before it finally rolls off the assembly line. So here's another example that's relevant to Wisconsin too, in terms of components for electrical equipment, electronics, appliances. There is an enormous continental trade in intermediate components for those goods: wiring, semiconductors, fuel cells, instruments, and a myriad other parts that move back and forth over the border as they are incorporated into more complex products. So this chart is actually an indication of how much the US and Canadian economies already form part of a continentally integrated production platform. And what's true of production is also true of services, and it's also true of investment patterns. We own each other's companies and we employ each other's people. There's about $500 billion in US foreign direct investment in Canada, and it's about the same the other way too. And if you think about it in terms of jobs, Canadian companies operating in the United States, that's that foreign direct investment. So Canadian owned or Canadian affiliated companies that are operating in the United States directly employ more than 900,000 Americans, and it goes the other way too. Now, you might recognize some of these brands. They're all affiliates of Canadian companies. Pacific Cycle, headquartered in Madison, is an affiliate of Durrell Industries, which is based in Montreal. BMO Harris, does anyone know what BMO stands for? Bank of Montreal. And I took the picture on this slide. It's a picture of a BMO branch that's right across from the state capitol in your city. And that company, BMO Harris, employs over 6,000 people in Wisconsin. The McCain Infinity Food Group, that employs about 3,300 people in your state. And of course, it goes entirely the other way. This is mutually beneficial. If you look at the sale of services in Canada by US-owned affiliates, we're talking about sales of services of more than $120 billion per year. That's US-owned companies providing services in Canada that Canadians are paying for. It goes both ways. This is an element of this integrated continental platform that we share between Canada and the United States that many people don't fully recognize, but it's also true for critical infrastructure. So this is a map of the main railway systems, and you'll see that this network of freight railways crisscrosses the border. They're moving goods back and forth across the border all the time. That is an integrated network in terms of tracks and rights of way. But it's also integrated in another way in terms of the cross ownership that I was just talking about. If you look down at the bottom right of this map, you'll see the little green square near Chicago on a line that is indicated in the legend as Canadian National. And you'll see a little purple triangle or square, I'm not sure, I can't make it out, that is a Canadian Pacific line. So here's an example of an integrated infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, moving goods back and forth, and people when the pandemic isn't around. And it's not just integrated in terms of an infrastructure, it's cross-owned by Americans owning lines in Canada, Canadians owning lines in the United States. Canadian National, CN, owns and operates the Duluth, Winnipeg, and Pacific Railway, which some of you might be familiar with. That employs, at last count, 1,500 people in Wisconsin. And Canadian Pacific owns and operates the Soo Line Railway, which employs about 550 people in your state. There's a similar story about the electricity system. It's completely integrated, this grid. And we trade electricity both ways across the border. The grids are fully integrated, and the flows depend on what part of the continent you're talking about. If you look almost far to the right there, you'll see one of the arrows and boxes points down from Canada that says 36.69 terawatt hours. That's the biggest number there because that is an enormous amount of electricity that is running from hydropower plants in Quebec through to the northeast of the United States, including New York State. But it's also the case that the power runs in both directions. And in fact, the direction of the flow in some cases will change as demand changes on both sides of the border. So here's another example of something that's just another map, another aspect of the integration between our two countries and what we share. And it's not just electricity, of course. Canada is by far the largest supplier to the United States, the largest supplier of oil, much more than any of the other foreign suppliers, natural gas and uranium, and a number of other vital natural resources that form part of a continental system for energy security and, frankly, for continental energy independence. Of course, we also work together as stewards of our natural environment. I'll give you just one example. Through the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, Canada and the United States jointly manage almost 20% of the world's surface freshwater, which provides drinking water for tens of millions of Canadians and Americans and sustains about 4,000 different species of plants and animals. But that cooperation is true also for air quality, for wildlife protection, and many other environmental concerns. When it comes to defense and security, well, we have another example of incredibly close cooperation. This is a photograph. I'm wondering whether anybody can guess what the photograph is. It's a photograph of the NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command Control Center in Colorado. And this is where the missile launches are detected around the world. And importantly, where all approaching airborne traffic to North America is identified, and where, if necessary, the orders go out to deploy interceptors to identify and intercept any unrecognized. I got a bit of an echo here. So everybody might want to turn off their.
Melanie, you need to have it on mute, please.
Yeah, mute. So NORAD performs this really critical function. And what's interesting, if you look at the picture, you'll see a man on the bottom right who's leaning over and talking to a man on his left. And if you look really closely on his shoulder, there's a little Canadian flag patch there. And the reason I show you this picture is because I've had the privilege of visiting NORAD headquarters, and it is extraordinary to see Canadian and American servicemen and women sitting side by side in a completely integrated command, where they are just doing their jobs with each other almost without regard for their nationality. In fact, that cooperation is so close that on that terrible day, September 11th, 2001, it was the Canadian deputy commander of NORAD who gave the order to scramble US fighter jets over American cities. Same is true for the cooperation between Canada and the United States overseas. And that defense partnership has been extremely close. Of course, it got a lot closer after the War of 1812. It wasn't too close then. But jokes aside, it really is extraordinarily close. And this photo is from Afghanistan, where Canada led the part of the mission that was in Kandahar, a difficult part of Afghanistan. And those Canadians there served for many years. They fought, and some of them died alongside their American colleagues in that country. So that's the story of how deeply connected our two countries already are. It's a story about how we make things together more than people realize. It's a story about how cross-investment benefits both countries. We own each other's companies. We employ each other's workers. It's a story about how we work together to protect our shared environment and secure our shared continent. I think it's a remarkable story that a lot of people haven't fully realized. And it's also why it makes sense, I think, for our two countries to confront new challenges, today's challenges, tomorrow's challenges together, just as we have in the past. Whether it's new economic challenges or new kinds of threats to our security, we already have a very powerful and effective platform to work from. And I'm not the only one who says this. Here's an example of a quote from a report that was written by former US Trade Representative Robert Zoellick and former General David Petraeus in a 2000 report. They said North America is the continental base for the United States. It should be the starting point for its geopolitical and geoeconomic perspectives. The development and implementation of a strategy for US economic, energy, security, environmental, and societal cooperation with its two neighbors can strengthen the United States at home and enhance its influence abroad. Well, I couldn't agree more. So let me continue. I don't need the slides anymore, although if anybody's interested, I'm always happy to put one or more of them back on. But let me just shift gears and say that there's a challenge. And the challenge now is that the roots of our relationship are strong, but as I said before, they need constant tending. Former Secretary of State George Shultz is one of the people who has likened diplomacy to gardening. In his words, it's important to deal with the irritants or the weeds in a relationship when they are small. And in doing so, you also build confidence and understanding. Now, I'm afraid that the bilateral relationship today is in need of some gardening. Most Canadians, or at least many Canadians, were startled, and that's a mild word, that the Trump administration imposed national security tariffs on imports of Canadian steel and aluminum. Those tariffs were later lifted. They have been threatened again since, but the shock in Canada and for many Canadians remained. It was difficult for my compatriots to understand how the United States government could see Canadian products as quote unquote national security threats to the United States. These kind of actions do have an impact. So does the language of our leaders. And the language of some leaders towards Canada has on several occasions shocked Canadians. Even political adversaries in our country do not talk to each other that way. So, you know, it's amazing how much these small graces matter in diplomacy. It's all about tending the garden. And here is what concerns me a little bit, that some of the actions of the current administration have had an impact on how Canadians see not just the president, but how they see the United States. And we've, you know, Canada and the United States, we've had disagreements and mild tensions before. We've had various trade disputes before, but it's always been within the framework of a respectful relationship. And when things have been going poorly, and they have at various times in the past been moments of discomfort or tension, and some presidents, frankly, have been more popular in Canada than others. Those concerns tended not to spill over into the view, the Canadians' view of the United States. I think it's revealing in a way of a new concern from Canadians about whether they can count on the US government. I think that that concern personally is exaggerated because in practice, the connection between our two countries remains strong, and that day-to-day cooperation between our governments continues to be excellent. But there are concerns, and given these public concerns in Canada, it's not surprising that some people have called to diversify Canada's trade relations so that we're trading more with other countries and maybe a little bit less exposed or dependent on the United States. Now, that's a lot easier said than done. Of course, it makes sense for Canada to expand its trade with other parts of the world, and we should be working hard at that. But our foremost objective, in my view, must always be to renew our relationship with the United States, to strengthen rather than weaken the bonds that help both of our countries to prosper and to remain safe. Still, I think many Canadians are also concerned about where the future of US trade policy may be heading, and whether Canada might be caught intentionally or unintentionally in a protectionist backlash, maybe one that's not directed so much at Canada, but at other parts of the world. We hear, and many of us here in Canada listen and hear both of your presidential candidates talking about tariffs, and we shudder. And it's not just because Canada can be a chilly place. It's because we also share many of the same concerns about our workers. And because workers in Canada and in the United States form part of a shared platform that provides great benefits to both countries. Now, I should say that this is just one of many challenges facing Canada and its foreign policy. There are others. Many Canadians, and I think many people who follow policy issues in Canada, are concerned about the weakening of international rules and norms, including international trade rules. So one of the things that Canada has done recently was pull together a group of countries to talk about trying to ensure that there's still a system to adjudicate trade disputes, even with the World Trade Organization experiencing such paralysis. There's other concerns. Canadians are concerned about China's increasing assertiveness and its targeting of Canada and many of our allies. You may know that 2 Canadians were arbitrarily arrested and spuriously accused of spying, and that China also introduced economic punishment measures on Canada, all because Canada responded positively and appropriately through established processes to the request for extradition of a senior Huawei executive who is wanted in the United States for alleged fraud. 2 years ago, Saudi Arabia targeted Canada for its own version of punishment after Canada had called for women human rights campaigners to be released from Saudi prison. At that time, Canadians were hoping that the United States would stand up more for Canada, but the State Department and White House did not really do that. They essentially said that Canada and Saudi Arabia should sort out their own problems, which in Canada, again, was a little surprising, you know, for a disagreement between a close democratic ally and over human rights to be treated kind of as, you know, you guys sorted out, was disappointing. So this is all part of a story for Canada that Canada's operating in a more difficult world, just like everybody else, and a nastier world for a middle power like Canada. Yet we know that we have friends throughout the United States, in Congress and state legislatures, among mayors and trade organizations. Some of our union workers belong to the very same unions as their US counterparts. And we also know, at least some people know, that a lot of the business of Canada-US relations is continuing along, and that in fact the relationship between the two governments is still very, very effective. But I think it's time for all to remind ourselves that Canada and the US have built the most effective partnership of any 2 countries in the world, and that we can and should face common economic and security and environmental challenges together, as we so often have. So as we both of our countries consider, for example, the need to reshore some supply chains like medical equipment, let's do that together. As we face, in some cases, unfair competition from certain countries that might dump their goods at below market prices or use state-owned enterprises to achieve political ends, let's push back against those practices together. And since we breathe the same air, drink the same water, share the same responsibility to ensure that future generations have a safe, clean, and healthy continent, let's redouble our cooperation on the environment. And we should be thinking about solutions and thinking about working together on solutions to some of the world's most pressing problems, and problems that will still be around after this pandemic emergency is over, like climate change. So let's plan and act together. And while I understand the idea behind Buy America measures, northern US states have potentially a lot to lose by being denied access to Canadian procurement contracts too. It makes much more sense to work together to ensure that we're serving our workers and building good jobs on this shared continental production platform. What we shouldn't do is take this remarkable partnership for granted. To paraphrase a speech that Harry Truman delivered in 1947, he said, you know, Canadian-American relations did not develop spontaneously. They didn't come about merely through the happy circumstance of geography. The closeness of our relationship is 1 part proximity and 9 parts goodwill and common sense. And finally, to quote another president, Ronald Reagan, quote, we're more than friends and neighbors and allies. We are kin who together have built the most productive relationship between any 2 countries in the world today. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and our discussion.
Yes, excuse me.
Now, somebody's microphone needs to be muted.
Yeah, please.
You have 2 videos on. You need to turn off one of the audios of those, Melanie, because they show both of them on.
I want to ask you a question.
Okay.
What is this?
Just close one of the videos.
Not.
I don't see it.
You're on the screen twice. You have,
Okay.
you must have computers on.
I'm going to remove the one that she doesn't appear to be using. Okay, go ahead, Melanie.
Yeah, okay.
That didn't do it.
I'm not even. What is this? I don't understand.
Okay, so Melanie, it's probably the best thing to do right now is for you, I'd say, to leave and rejoin the meeting. If you have that the same link. Okay, I'm going to unmute you, or try to unmute you. Okay, Melanie, can you unmute?
Okay.
Melanie, did you come into the meeting 2 different ways by chance?
Yes.
Okay, that's what's causing the problem.
Okay, I'll get out in one.
Very space age.
Okay, can you hear me now?
That's much better.
Yeah, okay. We have several questions, Dr. Parrish. And before I ask the questions, I would just like to say that we have a couple of other Canadians with us. I don't know what we call them now because they're not immigrants or they're not whatever, but we have Rob and Bette Vandenberg, who are former residents of Canada, and they are with us this evening because they particularly wanted to hear your presentation, and I'm sure that they're glad that they did. Also, the first question is, since 1812, has any relationship between our countries been as much of a challenge as it is today?
Well, you know, there's a paradox here because there isn't really rancor between Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump. There have been moments there have been outbursts, but they seem to have a decently effective working relationship with each other. There have been moments in the past where the relationship between the president and the prime minister have been more tense. Between Justin Trudeau's father and Richard Nixon, or even during the Vietnam War, there was a moment when the Canadian Lester Pearson delivered a speech in, I think it was Philadelphia, in which he said things that were interpreted as critical of the US involvement in the Vietnam War. And that, understandably, given that he was on American soil, caused a bit of a furor. But there have been these moments and these ups and downs. I think the difference between these previous periods of disagreement or tension, whether it's tension between the president and the prime minister or disagreement in terms of policy, the difference is the concern in Canada about whether the United States ultimately has Canada's back. I think I'm just trying to characterize what people are thinking, and this isn't necessarily the view of the Canadian government, but I think that there's something unique about this time that it's, there's always been the assumption in Canada, which obviously pays a heck of a lot more attention to the United States than the other way around. There's always been the assumption in Canada that, there'll be disagreements, and sometimes they can be quite sharp disagreements over various trade issues or whatever, but that ultimately the Canadians could count on the US government not to restrain itself and to treat Canada as a friend. I guess that's that sense that there were limits on what one could imagine the US government doing because of the nature of the friendship, that the disproportionate power wouldn't necessarily be used to harm Canada. And when things happen like the White House calls for, the 3M, the Minnesota company 3M, when it seeks to instruct the 3M not to ship any protective masks to Canada. I mean, it's hard to understate the impact that has on Canadian public perceptions, and how it reinforces, I think, a kind of concern about what does this mean for the relationship going forward. And I don't know, because I've only been alive for the time that I've been alive, but I don't recall that concern being part of a moment of difficulty with the United States before.
Okay, then the next question, and I think one of the things you're alluding to, Dr. Paris, that I think some of us have been concerned about is just sort of the disrespectful way in which conversations have been with not only with Canada, but with other countries. And as you indicated earlier, people just aren't used to that tone in dealing with heads of other countries. The next question is, in his throne speech yesterday, did your prime minister speak at all of Canada-US relations? Was climate change code for disunity?
Sure, I'd be happy to answer that. Maybe I can first just actually comment on what you said about the language. I mean, listen, the last thing I want to do is get into a debate about how the president is or isn't acting, or is or isn't speaking. I think what's fair to say is that for the government of Canada, that it's less what Donald Trump might be saying on a day-to-day basis, and more what is the government of the United States doing. And there's a lot more stability and predictability in the actions of the US administration across a range of areas than there might be in the day-to-day rhetoric of the president, which is colorful to say the least. And but it does have an impact on Canadian public opinion, certainly, and that's really what I'm referring to. I think at this point, you know, the Canadian officials learned a long time ago not to rise to any bait and just to keep focused on the work of managing the relationship. In terms of the throne speech, for those of you who don't know what that means, it's basically the kind of State of the Union address. In fact, the State of the Union address in the American system is a kind of descendant of the British parliamentary throne speech. And it's a way for the government to basically set out its agenda, just like in the State of the Union speech is a combination of reporting on what's happened and what's going to happen next. And there was a throne speech by the government, the Trudeau government in this country yesterday, which focused almost exclusively on the incredible public health emergency and economic crisis that our country is facing, just as your country and many other countries are facing. And it really said almost nothing about foreign policy and nothing about Canada-US relations. That doesn't mean the government doesn't prioritize Canada-US relations. It absolutely treats the relationship with the United States as a preeminent matter in terms of the priorities of the government, even if it wasn't mentioned in the throne speech. But people are worried about their health and their livelihood and what happens after emergency supports, economic supports might be over, and what's going to happen with, why is there waiting time to get COVID tests and other issues that are, in this country right now and elsewhere. And so this throne speech or State of the Union address really focused on domestic issues. The mention of climate change isn't code for disunity. Dealing with climate change is a long-standing policy priority for the Trudeau government, and we do have a carbon tax in this country, which is controversial in some jurisdictions, particularly in the western province of Alberta, which is a major oil producing part of the country, and elsewhere. And so, we do have tensions in our country. Like any place, there's political tensions. And there are a couple of major tensions and issues in our domestic politics that have been, in some ways, they've been disguised by the urgency of the COVID crisis, but they're still there. And one of them is the relationship between those Western resource producing provinces and the rest of the country over policy differences. And another issue is the reconciliation with our Aboriginal people, which is a major unresolved, frankly, it's an open wound, which is going to take a lot of work and a lot of time to heal.
Okay, one other question I have is, could you speak a little bit more about Canada-China relations and how you see that going?
So right now, their Canada-China relations are worse than they've been at any time since the two countries established diplomatic relations, which was all the way back in 1970. And the main reason for the current tension has to do, first and foremost, with the standoff between the two countries. As I mentioned in my presentation, you probably are familiar with the case of Meng Wanzhou, who is the chief financial officer of the Chinese telecommunications giant Huawei. And when she was about to arrive to change planes in Canada, in Vancouver, Canadian officials received a request from the US Department of Justice to detain her pending an formal extradition request on what turned out to be charges of fraud and wire fraud and bank fraud, all in relation to alleged efforts by her and her company to evade and violate US sanctions on Iran. Canada has a pre-established procedure for dealing with extradition requests. It's none of the elected officials ever consider those requests in the first instance. There are officials in our Department of Justice who look at the basic merits, and there was an arrest order that was issued, and she was detained in Vancouver. And her right now, there is the beginnings of her actual hearing, extradition hearing, after many motions have been gone through in this judicial proceedings. Almost immediately after she was arrested, China detained two Canadians, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. Michael Spavor is a consultant, and Michael Kovrig is a former Canadian diplomat who was working for a non-governmental organization called the International Crisis Group. And they were thrown in jail and apparently under very harsh conditions. And since then, relations between Canada and China have been very tense. And they were eventually charged formally with espionage, which is made up, and it's not the first time that China has done this. They concocted espionage charges against another Canadian a few years ago who was also being held as a kind of hostage to apply pressure on Canada to do something that China wanted Canada to do. There are a number of people in Canada who want to trade her away for the two Canadians. Several people who feel that this wasn't our problem in the first place. She's not indicted in Canada, she's indicted in the United States. And meanwhile, we're the ones, this argument goes, that are bearing the brunt of Chinese retaliation. And it's not just our two citizens, it's others who were suddenly, who had already been arrested in China, who were suddenly sentenced with capital punishment. The sentence hasn't been effected. And also, all of a sudden, there were kind of problems with various Canadian agricultural exports to China that were stopped, canola being an example, canola seeds, and many others. So that's where things stand. Relations are effectively frozen. The Prime Minister has rejected the calls from some people to negotiate a kind of prisoner exchange, so to speak. He doesn't think that that's a wise thing to do. He thinks that that will just reward China for its bullying tactics and encourage China to arrest more Canadians when they want Canada to do things. And so in the meantime, Canadian public opinion towards China has soured dramatically, as you would imagine, quite dramatically. And although Canadians are now very angry about China's treatment of Canada, they still would rather negotiate an outcome to this or have a diplomatic outcome to this than to continue an escalation in terms of, tit for tat between Canada and China. And frankly, bilaterally, Canada-China, China can out-escalate Canada. They have more leverage over us than we have over them, which is why Canada's been working so hard to bring together our allies to have a common stand about how unacceptable it is for China to detain these apparently innocent people for the purposes of kind of blackmail.
Also, one other question that's, of course, a lot of interest in the United States, and I'm just wondering about in Canada. Do you all have interference from the Russians or any other foreign country in your elections? Have you been aware of that sort of thing?
Less than what we've seen. Of course, I can't fully answer the question because, people who know the answer to that question have security clearances, and I haven't seen those kind of materials. So I can only go by what has been publicly reported. And we had an election last fall, and I guess it was October of 2019, almost a year ago. And everyone was on high alert for possible Russian interference in our election. I don't think it materialized to the same degree as it clearly materialized in your election in 2016, which was shocking for an international security expert like me looking at that, or even the way we've seen Russia's interference in elections in some European countries, an attempt to interfere. So I think this is part of another area in which all of our countries are like-minded democratic countries need to be working more closely together to clearly establish for countries like China or Russia that certain kinds of behavior will not be tolerated, and working all together that we can back up that, those bottom lines. So there's lots of room for even further cooperation. And, I hope that we all as a kind of democratic community get our acts together a little bit more than we have, because I think those who seek to disrupt democracies and to demoralize and divide democracies, that those people are not really facing the kind of pushback that they must if they're going to stop doing it.
Good. Well, Dr. Paris, thank you so much. And I'm going to conclude with a comment that one of the participants has made, and she says, it's a wonderful presentation, and that we love Canadians and we want them to love us too. So we love that you came today and are with us, and we hope to see you again in person one day. And thanks so much for being with us. And again, the wild clapping can be heard in the background. Thank you and good night. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It was a real pleasure. And as I said, this isn't a regular relationship. This runs much deeper, our two countries, and those roots are very, very deep. So I wouldn't worry about their health at this time. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for all the attendees for joining us. I hope you appreciated this. We hope you enjoyed it, and come back again next month.